In my book, Jewish Roots, for all of you that are now in this clip, I talk about the nature of the content of the Mosaic Law and why life in Israel was better than life anywhere else, and the extraordinary uh, quality of Israel's laws and justice and humane nature. And we're not going to have time to go over that here. I also speak about this in another book I wrote called Social Justice, where I argue that if you're going to deal with social justice, you have to deal with the issues of the application of Torah to social issues, looking at it through the lens of the New Covenant, of course, but still extraordinarily applicable. But now we want to continue from the Torah to show what happens with Israel. Israel comes into the Promised Land, and throughout the course of Israel's history, we read the story of Israel's obedience and disobedience, good times and bad times. But it seems like the bad times are more dominant than the good times, that the disobedience is more prominent than the obedience. We see it in the book of Judges, where Israel falls away into idolatry, then has to be rescued by various heroes who become the judges. But then finally, Israel has to ask for a king under that great prophet Samuel. They are allowed to have a king, and King Saul. That fails, and then eventually David is chosen, and we read about the wonderful promises to the Davidic dynasty. But Israel's history, although looking much better under King David and the early part of Solomon, ends up being primarily a history of unfaithfulness to God's calling and to the covenant. And it looks like things are very dark for Israel, and we wonder what is going to happen, because the prophets, the prophet Isaiah, the prophet Jeremiah, they predict a terrible exile and a destruction of Jerusalem, and in Jeremiah explicitly the temple. And this terrible destruction is not the end of it. They also predict a return to the land of Israel. Now, the prophets also indicate that after the return to the land of Israel, Israel is going to enter into a period of great battle between the nations under darkness who will seek to destroy them, and they will be empowered by God to fight these last battles and to be victorious. But you read about these last battles in Joel chapter 3, you read about it in Ezekiel 38 to 39, you read about it in Zechariah 12 to 14, and many, many other texts, Isaiah 25 to 27. And after the battles of these days, then we read about the promise that Israel will fulfill her destiny in bringing the nations to the knowledge of God, because in Isaiah chapter 2, we read about the great promise that all nations will come up to Jerusalem, and the word of the Lord will go forth from Jerusalem, and the Torah will go forth from Zion. We read about the promise in Isaiah chapter 11 that the wolf will lie down with the lamb, the lion will eat straw like an ox, and all of nature will be changed, and there'll be world peace where all nations will be one and rightly connected to Israel. We do begin to read that that's going to take place under the rulership of David's greater son, the Messiah, especially Isaiah chapter 11, where we read, "He will strike the earth with a sword that comes from his mouth." In Isaiah chapter 7 and 9, we read about his leadership being a key to bring Israel into the fulfillment of her destiny. Right now, we've really gotten ahead of ourselves here, but that's okay. Now we want to come back as to what answer can be given to the unfaithfulness of Israel. And here we read a significantly important promise. And the promise is that because Israel failed under the Mosaic covenant, God is going to bring a better covenant with better promises. Although the Mosaic covenant was a covenant of grace, God is going to bring a covenant of greater grace to Israel, and he's going to change Israel, or the Jewish people, from the inside, both nationally, corporately, but also every individual. So we want to look at the promise of the new covenant in Jeremiah. One of the big problems of theology is that people read the New Testament and they assume they know what the new covenant is, and they don't read the text in context to really see how Jewish the new covenant is and what it's supposed to do and what it promises. So I want us to take time to read from Jeremiah chapter 31 and then Ezekiel 36 on the content of the new covenant. Verse 30 of chapter 31, "Behold, the days are coming, it is a declaration of Adonai, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." Wait a minute. You're thinking, isn't the new covenant made with everybody who confesses Yeshua? It's true, everybody that confesses Jesus enters into the new covenant. But that's not what the text says here. Here, the text is that the new covenant is made with the Jewish people. It's not made with the nations. And when we get to the new covenant scriptures, we can talk about how people from the nations get in on it, because by being connected to the Jewish people, the new covenant then applies to them. But the new covenant applies to them because it is a fulfillment of the blessing of Abraham coming to the nations. That's why Gentiles, or those from the nations that come to faith, are called children of Abraham by faith. But it's made with Israel and Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they broke my covenant. It's not like that covenant because they broke it. It was a covenant of grace, but they broke it even though as a husband to them. It is a declaration of the Lord. But this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days. It is a declaration of Adonai. I will put my Torah, or law, Torah I like better, but law is the most common translation, within them. I will write it on their heart. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will each teach his neighbor or each his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. It is a declaration of Adonai, for I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. Now, to read this is to be amazed, because this is a pro-Torah covenant. It doesn't do away with the Torah. It writes the teaching content, as it's applicable, I say always, but it writes the teaching content of the Torah, the law, on the heart. God becomes more intimately related to us. Each person individually will know Adonai, and know here means have an intimate relationship with God beyond what was known in the Mosaic period. And God will forgive their sins, forgive their iniquity, and remember their sin no more. And then God promises, as part of this covenant, as much as the sun and the moon continue, that he will not reject Israel's offspring from being a nation, but that the nation of Israel will continue to live before God forever and will fulfill its destiny through the new covenant. The fact that this covenant is a Jewish covenant, and it's stated in this way so explicitly, along with the promise of the preservation of Israel and the writing of the Torah upon the heart, you would not get that through the preaching of many churches today. It's like, when they talk about the new covenant, it's like, have they ever really read what it says? And it becomes even more explicit in Ezekiel, where we read that the nature of this covenant really does lead to Israel's ultimate deliverance and the salvation of the nations, which we see as we read from chapter 37 to 39 of Ezekiel. But the central text here In Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 24, we read, "For I will take you from the nations, I will gather you out of all the countries and bring you back to your own land. Then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean from all your uncleanliness and from all your idols. Moreover, I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit within you, and I will remove the stony heart from your flesh, and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit in you, my ruach, and then I will cause you or move you to walk in my laws." Wow. "So that you'll keep my rulings and do them. Then you will live in the land that I gave to your fathers, and you will be my people, and I will be your God." Ezekiel is prophesying this at the same time period as Jeremiah. Ezekiel in Babylon, Jeremiah in the land of Israel, saying the same thing. Yeshua referred to this passage probably when he said to Nicodemus, "How can you not know what it means to be born again, being a teacher of Israel, that you have to be born of water and the Spirit?" And here it talks about sprinkling clean water on you. And so Nicodemus should have known about the teaching on being born again from Ezekiel chapter 36. Once again, we are reading a parallel passage. It doesn't use the word new covenant, but that's what it's speaking about a promise of God changing us from within, writing the Torah upon our hearts, giving us a new spirit, putting the Holy Spirit within us, and moving us to obedience. So it doesn't depend on us. It's solely by grace. It's by grace through faith that we are saved, and we receive this forgiveness. We receive this new heart, and then God works righteousness in us supernaturally. What an extraordinary statement of what New Covenant faith is. So when we come to the end of the scriptures, of the Hebrew scriptures, we're not finding us coming to something that is doing away with the Torah, doing away with the promises to ethnic national Israel, but no, intensifying that promise and vouchsafing it and making it all the more secure and certain that Israel is going to be rescued by God, brought back to her land, given a new covenant, and will yet be the instrument of bringing the nations to the knowledge of God. Now, how this is going to be ultimately fulfilled, where Israel has victory over the forces of evil, becomes clearly promised as happening through the king, David's greater son, the Messiah, who will be the one who will lead Israel into this victory. And as we read in Isaiah chapter 42 and 49, that not only will he restore the tribes of Israel, but he will bring salvation to all of the nations of the world, so that Israel fulfills her destiny only under the leadership of the Messianic King. And that brings us to the close of the theology of the Hebrew Scriptures. And now we will, in our next clip, go into the New Covenant Scriptures. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter and also get a hold of the books. And of course, you're invited to take the longer course if you're being inspired by these clips.